Hey everyone, so I wanted to go ahead and start off this new playlist on my channel called Heatseeker Fundamentals, where I'm essentially going through a bunch of small topics. It should be videos of 5 to 10 minutes, where I'm just covering a lot of the common fundamental core sort of knowledge base that you need to build. A lot of this content has already been covered in sessions by Glitch on his channel, just that those videos are much longer, and I know not everyone likes to filter through a whole video, and if they want to just look for a specific topic, hopefully this series will allow people to come focus on the few things that they are looking for and, in a quicker, more digestible video. So for today, first video I want to start this off with is just volume. This is the most important thing that we look at on a day-to-day whenever we're analyzing these maps. And of course, the calculation itself used for Gex and Vex is proprietary, but I'll just be saying, okay, so I won't be going into how it's actually calculated, and that's something that's kept confidential for obvious reasons. But sort of from everything we get output on the tool, from the tool, right? How do we best utilize that? And that's what I want to be covering for today. So first thing I want to cover is that volume is the most important thing that you need to look for. So I know obviously the signs are or the sign of the number is also visualized through the color, but the volume is often what I look for first, and then the secondary step is what the sign is, right? So that's actually I'm going to cover that in the subsequent video, the very next one. So when we're looking at sign volume, obviously the very strong nodes, so the king nodes would show up with the star on it for a given ticker on Trinity or on the individual map. That's obviously our strongest value, and that is taking the absolute value, right? So we can have a negative king node. So for example, right now SPX on 6650 is a negative king node, right? So I would not assume that it's always going to be positive, right? Many times it is, but it can also equally be negative throughout the day. And this is all these maps, right? The volume is shifting around constantly. It's moving from node to node. Nodes are shrinking and growing. So this is also something that's dynamic. It's not something that just because we see a king node, at 10 a.m., that is still going to be there at 3 p.m., right? Some days it will be, some days it won't be. So one of the big things is we can never take these strong nodes as a definite thesis, right? Like we can never say price must go up towards 6650 on SPX because we have a king node there. Because what happens if an hour passes and now that node is actually has gone down, right? We have very low volume there, and all that volume has shifted to a node at 6550, for example, right? So think of them as more moving targets. So to assume that prices has to gravitate towards them is a big risk unless you see a good confluence on the chart or across the three indexes. So always one of the biggest errors people will have is they see very large nodes, assume price will go there, and that'll be their whole thesis. But if we're not actually deflecting off of a different node, or if we're not having like a very strong chart thesis, then a lot of times those plays can break down quite heavily, right? So often the safest way to play these maps is actually when we see strong nodes, we actually wait for price to hit them, approach them and tap them and play the reversal away from those nodes, right? Because we're assuming they'll hold as either a floor or a ceiling. So that's the more appropriate way to play the tool, right? When you'll have a much higher win rate and much more success if you trade in that manner. So even if we do have a strong node upside, right? A lot of times when I start looking for a play, I'm looking for what downside node can I bounce off of and give me that push upwards, right? So often, what node are we deflecting off of? And that's why you always hear trade deflections and trade reversals, right? So often the best strategies that pair with Heatseeker are any kind of reversal-based strategies, and that's the reason why. So one of the big things to note is, okay, we're trying to our first glance, we need to look at where we have strong nodes, obviously sometimes positive, sometimes negative. So when I compare them, I'm often just taking the absolute value mentally. And then basically that's where I'm deciding what my actual bias is. So when I'm deciding what ceilings or what floors I expect to hold and that I can play a deflection off of, it's based purely on volume. I do use the sign. I'll go over this in the next video, but basically I'm looking at what sign the node is, right? So if it's positive or negative to help me decide how I'm going to enter the trade and how I'm going to execute. But my actual thesis off of a positive and a negative node oftentimes is almost the same, right? In terms of will we bounce up or will we bounce down, right? So that's the first big thing is, right, we need to be looking at the volume, the actual number. That's always going to be primary. Now, the next thing is, okay, for obviously a lot of nodes have strong volume at times. So how do we actually differentiate which ones should matter more and which ones don't, right? So obviously the king node is a very obvious one that it should matter as it's the strongest node on the map. But many times we'll have nodes that are very, very close, right, to the king node, or even nodes that are half, a third of the size, but they'll still matter, right? So when we're trying to establish, for example, in the case of SPX, right, where we have a king node at 6,650, so we know that if price gravitates all the way up there, we could see a rejection back down, right? But equally, we have a node down here like 6,600, right, which is also a very strong psychological level that is about 60% of the volume of that king node. So this is also a level that can reject price if we see a strong thesis on the chart or if we see good alignment with QQQ and SPY. So it's not only the strongest node that you need to look for, and the rule of thumb I give for like how how small of a node can it be that still matters most cases, is around 20 to 25%, right? So oftentimes I'm looking for nodes that are about a fourth and sometimes a little bit under, but usually around a fourth is a good ballpark of, okay, if our king node is, for example, in this case on SPY 27,000, I'm going down all the way to like 7 or 8,000. I'm saying, okay, these are nodes that could matter, right? And so this is quite important because we're not always going to be near the king node. So for example, in SPX, when the king node is 60 points above current price, there's other nodes that could influence before we even get close to that king node, and we may never even go to that king node, right? So for example, this 6,600 level, or even the 6,620 level. Both of these are nodes that are comparable to this king node, right? Like I think the 6,620 is around 30%. So this is still something that could matter, right? So a lot of times price sometimes will deflect off these. So these are still uh, pockets of volume that you want to pay attention to. And a lot of times these smaller nodes will actually form and they'll be gatekeepers, right? So I'll make a subsequent video on this as well, but gatekeeper nodes are essentially any nodes that could deflect price before we reach the king node, right? So 6,600 and 6,620 are great examples in this screenshot on SPX of potential gatekeepers, right? But I'll explain more how those work and how we trade them in a future video. Okay, the next thing I want to go over is everything I've gone over is what do we use to define what an actual strong node is. There is also the opposite question of like how small of a node just doesn't matter at all. So there's two things to go into here. One, when we have very small nodes, right? So for example, on SPX right here, we have this pocket here of very small nodes, this pocket here. These are called air pockets or air gaps. And again, I'll probably make another video covering this in more detail, but a lot of times what we expect in these ranges is very little resistance, right? Because we we have an absence of a strong node. So a lot of times price will tend to traverse these zones pretty easily, right? Whether they're positive or negative, if it's low volume, a lot of times price will traverse it. So the positive versus negative has a little influence, which again, I think I'll cover that in a subsequent video. Um, the key point here is whenever I look at a map, I'm often looking on what is the king node, of course, to see where, like, what level it is at and if it's close, possible that we can reject off of it. But I'm also using it to look at what the actual number is and define, okay, for that given number, what are the other nodes that could have influence that maybe just don't show as strong color-wise, right? So for example, on SPY, 658 could have a huge influence, but it's showing more of a dull green, right? Or even down here, 650. So these are still nodes that you want to keep track of. That if you just use more of a number approach, this will be a lot more evident. I will also say, if you use Trinity with this color mode on, or even if you look at, I'll show another example after, but if you show an individual ticker that has very strong nodes not on the current week, sometimes the colors will not clue you in, right? So for example, right now on SPY, this is something where almost all the colors look the same. So you're actually having to find the king node just based on the number itself, right? So if you're ever in doubt, and this is something I would always double check after you do find, even if it's a good thesis, is check what the numbers are and double check that it's a strong node, that we're bouncing off of a node that still has relatively strong volume. And that's always going to be very, very important. Okay. Now to move on, so another thing I'll mention regarding the volume that we're looking at is when we look at any kind of small ticker, right? So for example, right here, Spotify, or a ticker that gets, not that it's small price-wise, but that it gets very low volume, a lot of times we'll see some very, very small nodes, right? So there's also a minimum like threshold value that you should look at, because Heatseeker, same as like any trading approach that is based more on volume. So if anyone does, for example, like fair value gaps, right? Fair value gaps hold better if the ticker being traded has a lot of volume, right? And um, that's the reason most people that trade fair value gaps do it on very high liquidity futures, right? So like on NQ, ES, the Mag 7, for example. So that's these patterns that we see repeat over and over, these levels that we expect to hold, no matter the strategy, a lot of times do better when there's good, strong volume on that ticker. So when we look at tickers that have very low volume, and there's a couple ways to identify these off the maps, and then there's actually a couple of ways off the option chain that I'll explain both. But those tend to be tickers that we need to exercise a bit more caution because we know that a lot of the assumptions that we make can fall apart a little quicker, right? Or a lot of times the positions that are taken can be unwinded or new positions can be added very, very quickly because there's not a lot of volume that can completely shift our thesis or our bias, right? So a lot of times the minimum I look for, like the general recommendation is anything on GEX, so related to gamma, you're gonna want to look for nodes that are at least 1,000 in volume, or sorry, 1 million. Because if you look at the maps, right, we have 185.5K. So this is 185,000. So you're looking for anything that has 1 million at least, right? So that doesn't mean that we can't trade tickers that have lower, smaller nodes, but it means that we have to acknowledge it's a clue for us that it's a lower volume ticker. And if we do trade it, we may have to exercise a bit more caution or just keep a closer eye on it because it's something where the whole map can reshuffle very, very strongly, or maybe some of the levels are less likely to be respected. So generally, I'll tend to size smaller if I notice that a specific map has very low volume nodes. And the general rule of thumb there, again, is you want to look for 4 digits in front of the decimal, so more than 1 million on the GEX. Then on the VEX, you're generally looking for at least 5 digits in front of the decimal. So for example, this case, right, we're looking at 15 million. This is actually sizable enough VEX, right? But again, I'll check GEX and VEX and make sure that I have decent volume on both. So in a case like Spotify, I'd either trade a very light size or even just skip the play if I'm not seeing sufficient volume on that ticker. Okay, so the last thing I'll cover, just to wrap up this video, is lumping. So what I mean by lumping is a lot of times we'll get stacks of nodes, right? So for example, let's take the example down here of 650 and 648 on SPY, right? So these two nodes, actually that might not be the best example. Let's look at 590 and 591 on QQQ. Usually it's better if they're right adjacent to each other. So a lot of times something that's very important to notice is QQQ, our king node is down at 583, right? So a lot of people will tend to overfixate on where that largest node is or where most of the color is if they're looking based on color. It's also quite important to look at what the actual values are. And sometimes if they're adjacent nodes, you can sort of stack them and add them together. So a lot of times what I'll do, so for example, on this 590 and 591 on QQQ, it looks like it's a very weak node. They look strong, but not as strong, right? Perhaps as this downside. But if you look at the total volume across the two of them, right, we do have 17 million, so it's still quite a sizable node, right? So a lot of times I'll lump nodes. So for example, these two nodes here on SPY, down here at the very bottom on SPY. So at 642, 643, we have 20 million volume here, right? It's just split over two nodes. At 648, 650, we have 24 million volume. So at first glance, SPY looks like 655 is the only like very strong node, but if you start breaking and like sort of looking at some of these adjacent pairs, you'll see that there's some other pockets of volume that look very, very strong, right? So again, not saying this setup is any good or anything, right? Like obviously this is going to reshuffle at market open tomorrow. But I think one big thing is if you are able to look at some of these adjacent nodes and add them together in cases where they're both sort of medium strength nodes, a lot of times you'll notice you have very strong pockets of volume that just aren't on a specific node. They're sort of split across two, three, or I've seen even up to four nodes. So that's also something I look for where, and you'll see this in other videos of mine, is I'm looking at the combined value, right? And that's sort of helping to guide my thesis. So another thing I'll sometimes do, this one takes a bit more time though, is I'll just look at sometimes wherever spot price is, I'm looking at do we have majority of volume above or below? And that's sort of just helping to guide of, okay, if I'm looking for a deflection upwards and I'm seeing that the majority of volume is above price, that's sort of a good confluence. Whereas if I'm summing what's above and below and I'm seeing all the volume is below price, that's maybe a bit worse of a confluence, and maybe, I'll trade less size on that play or sometimes skip it entirely. Yeah, so that should be all for this video. This is just in terms of a lot of the volume patterns I'm seeing, what I look for, some sort of general guidelines. Everything I've said today has only had to do with numbers, so it's just the absolute value of the number. The next video will go over the sign of the nodes and how that influences how we should execute and the expected behavior of price in those areas, right? But everything for right now has just been complete volume based, just to sort of step y'all in. So I'm hoping this series of videos will sort of go in sequential order. So as you progress, you'll sort of be adding an extra bit of information at each point. But I wanted to start it from not zero, but from sort of simpler, and then sort of start pushing into more of those complex topics as I go on. Okay, great. Thanks, everyone.